Welcome back. My name's Tony, and this is a channel where I talk fairly openly about some of my life experiences and what I've learned along the way, often the hard way. So this is the second video in a three-part series about the fun and thrilling topic of narcissism. In part one, I shared the 5 toxic behaviours of my narcissistic ex. So click the link in the description below if you want to watch that. In this video, I'm digging deeper into why some of us end up entangled in these sorts of relationships. Rather than walking away at the first or second sign of a red flag, there's obviously some part of some of us that tolerates the melodrama. And yes, the narcissist is a master manipulator. But I think we also need to examine some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our own role in choosing to stay with someone like that. So here are the 5 reasons I think I stayed hooked into the cycle of narcissistic abuse, which went on and off for 5 years. Okay, first up, and yes, I know this is stating the bleeding obvious, but no one is all bad. And that's what makes it confusing. In a film, it's very easy to spot the villain. In real life, the villain cooks you dinner, tells you you're amazing, and then, for no apparent reason, stonewalls you for days. And if you're the empathetic type, if you naturally like to see the best in people, you're the dream target of the narcissist. Kyle, that's what we'll call him, Kyle could be thoughtful, he was intelligent, creative, well-read, he didn't scream and shout, he didn't hit me. Sure, he showed plenty of other toxic behaviours. I mentioned some in my previous video, but there were plenty of other things, like being drunk and really embarrassing in social situations, being very unreliable, all the usual dysfunctional stuff. But there were always excuses. It was stress, exhaustion, someone had wronged him, I wasn't being supportive enough. And because none of his bad behaviour felt like a direct attack on me, because he wasn't yelling or being violent, I just didn't see it as abuse. And I kept thinking, well, he's not always like this. Let's focus on the positive. So I just told myself, well, maybe it is stress. Maybe it is trauma. Maybe if I loved him more, loving them more doesn't work. In fact, it makes it worse. Because the more you love them, the shittier they get. I noticed a pattern. Do you know when Carl was the nicest? Just at the point where I was clearly starting to pull away from the relationship. Suddenly, he'd be on his best behaviour, ultra polite, very attentive. And as soon as he thought he had me back, he'd find some excuse to go all weird again. So we'd go through these phases of having a few weeks of everything being lovely, and just at the point where it felt like we'd rekindled a sense of trust and safety, that's when he'd stonewall again. Now, I think there are a couple of reasons for this. I think that often part of being a narcissist is being a fantasist. They create this fantasy life and a fantasy version of themselves, and they expect other people to believe that no matter how much evidence to the contrary starts piling up. And they don't like it if they feel they've been caught out. So I think Kyle really likes the idea of being some kind of romantic hero. He just genuinely didn't know how to sustain it in any real or grounded way. Maybe that's why the narcissist loves melodrama, so they can make this big emotional comeback. And I think he also had a fantasy version of me. He put me on a pedestal, and then if I deviated ever so slightly from the script he had in his head of how things should play out, then he'd punish me for it. You know, he was the kind of guy who'd punish me for being ill or injured because it ruined his plans. And I've got some horror stories, but we'll save those for another day. But there's another reason why the more we love them, the shittier they get. I think it's because they can't actually tolerate things being good. So they sabotage intimacy. maybe because they need the drama, or maybe because deep down they really don't feel worthy of love. And so, of course, that's when people like us step in, the empaths, the fixers, the good partners. We try to love them better. We try to prove them wrong. We try to show them that they are lovable. But the more love you give, the less they seem to respect you. And I've come to learn there is a name for that: devaluation. And it is brutal because it's part of the cycle of abuse. And this is how it played out with Kyle. Partway through the stonewalling, he'd throw me these little scraps of attention and affection, just enough to keep me hooked. And this is really hard to admit because it sounds so pathetic, but you end up feeling incredibly grateful for those tiny scraps of affection. It gives you hope. So then when the stonewalling finally ends and they suck you back in and start love bombing again, it feels like a feast. And here's why that's really bad. Instead of acknowledging the sheer fucked upness of it, you just feel so relieved and happy that everything's good again that you bask in it. And even though you know the drama isn't really your fault, you try and regain some control by taking responsibility for it, by saying to yourself, how can I make sure this never happens again? So it's this really dysfunctional cycle where they emotionally starve you, giving you just enough to keep you trying, and you end up working harder and harder just to earn a few crumbs of kindness. And that, my friends, is what's known as trauma bonding. And if you've never experienced or witnessed that kind of dynamic before, it's incredibly hard to recognize it when you're in the middle of it. I think because it's such an emotional whirlwind, you're too busy trying to make sense of all the chaos to see that there's a pattern. And eventually, and this is the worst part, you do start to look like the crazy one they've accused you of being all along, because inevitably you do get anxious and insecure because you're walking on eggshells. Okay, so far I've been speaking a lot from the perspective of being a victim, being on the receiving end. And for a long time, when someone said that in a relationship it takes two to tango, my knee-jerk response was, yeah, but the narcissist, except with them, you try and be the good guy and they throw it all back in your face. And that's true. You know, loving a narcissist really is like pouring all your energy into a black hole. No matter how much you give, it never feels like enough. However, we also need to take a cold, hard, honest look at ourselves. Not just at the empathy and the goodwill that keep us trying, but the messy, uncomfortable, dysfunctional parts of ourselves that kept us hooked. And some of these are really hard to admit. But if any of the next few insights do sound familiar, remember you're not broken. You just have a few weak spots that need some tough love if you want to take back control. Remember I said that narcissists are also fantasists? Well, when we find ourselves tolerating their shitty behaviour, it's basically because we're fantasists too. Just in a slightly different way, but one that fits perfectly with the narcissist like pieces of a jigsaw. So if I'm being brutally honest, I didn't actually fall in love with who Kyle really was. I fell in love with the potential I projected onto him, the sweet, sensitive guy I saw buried beneath all the chaos. And I was in love with the imaginary future I kept building in my head, the one he'd promised me at the start, the one we'd live once he'd overcome his trauma. And hey, let's be real, we say because at the very least we tolerate melodrama, and maybe deep down there's even a tiny little part of us that enjoys it in some weird perverse way, or at least expects it. I think perhaps we've all been a little bit conditioned by Hollywood to expect a bit of romantic chaos. So really, we were both lost in stories. It's just that mine was about healing and redemption, and his was about control and adoration. Okay, so this next one is also really hard to admit. You're with them for the ego boost. We talk a lot about narcissists seeking supply, the supply of attention, admiration, control, basically anything that feeds their sense of importance and power. But here's the thing, they become our supply too. The love bombing, the flattery, it's hard to resist. It is intoxicating. I felt cherished and adored in ways I'd never experienced before. So let's not beat around the bush. I got something from it too, a good old ego massage. And when someone else's validation becomes your oxygen, you'll bend over backwards to keep it flowing, even when it hurts. I used to think that I didn't need external validation, but the truth is we all do to some extent. We've all got little cracks and weak spots in our ego, our character, but whatever you want to call it, the narcissist can sniff those out like a bloodhound. And the thing is, of course, we need to feel loved and appreciated in relationships. That's not wrong, that's human, but it needs to be authentic, it needs to be consistent, not something that gets switched on and off like a tap and used as a power trip. And if I'm being totally honest, I think for me, there was another kind of ego trip. I'm stubborn. I don't like to quit. I was determined to be the one who stuck by him, the one whose love finally healed him. I told myself I was being loyal, but in hindsight, that was probably a lot more about my ego than I cared to admit. I wanted to be the exception, the saviour. And a friend at the time told me that I probably had a bit of a rescue complex going on, and I totally denied it, of course, but he was right. And what I'm describing is also classic codependency, deriving your sense of worth from fixing and supporting other people, even at your own expense. And once the narcissist sees that your identity depends on being a good person, they'll milk it. And they'll lose all respect for you because you let them. Okay, my final insight is this. If you stay in a relationship like this for too long, it does start to change you. Over time, your nervous system gets so frayed that you start to behave in ways you don't recognize. You snap, you withdraw, you say things you regret, you find yourself swinging between anger and guilt and lashing out one minute and then desperately trying to smooth things over. And that starts to feel like you're becoming the monster, like you've contracted some kind of weird narcissist virus. But the good news is, you've got a lot more self-awareness than the narcissist, and that's the antidote. And after you've been exposed to the narcissist, there's a very good chance you're inoculated against any further bullshit. I think recognizing these patterns is more than half the battle. But in my next video, I'll offer the advice I'd give to my younger self, things to safeguard against wasting any more precious time and energy on the narcissist. So thanks very much for watching. Please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and the notification bell if you want to see part 3 in a few days' time. And as always, feel free to drop a comment below if any of this resonates, or to share any of your insights from your experiences. Take care and see you soon.